It was October 2021, the kind of fall that creeps in slowly, making you forget summer ever existed. My name is Daniel, and back then, I was just another guy living in Chicago, working a dull IT job, thinking the scariest thing in life was missing a deadline. But that changed when I got the invitation. My old friend Mark, who I hadn't spoken to in years, sent me a cryptic email. Dan, we're heading up to the cabin in the Hockomock Swamp. I know you remember the place. It's been too long. We need to talk. Mark. Hockomock Swamp is in Massachusetts, part of the Bridgewater Triangle, an area known for strange disappearances, ghost sightings, and bizarre lights in the sky. When we were younger, Mark and I spent countless nights up there, camping with friends, daring each other to explore the abandoned logging trails. We laughed about the stories, Native American curses, glowing orbs, shadow figures, but even as kids, there was something off about that place. We never stayed after dark without a roaring fire and at least 3 people keeping watch. I hadn't thought about the cabin in years. Mark's family owned it, a single-room structure built back in the 1800s. No plumbing, no electricity, just a fireplace, a few old bunks, and a locked iron trapdoor in the floor. I remember Mark's grandfather telling us never to open it, though he never said why. We used to joke that it was where they kept bodies. Now, as an adult, that joke didn't seem so funny. I should have ignored the email, but something about it stuck with me. Mark sounded serious. And there was something else. His email was sent from an account I didn't recognize, one with a long string of numbers instead of a name. I tried calling his number, but it was disconnected. That was the first warning sign. The second came when I mentioned the trip to my girlfriend, Rachel. She froze when I said Hockomock Swamp. "You're joking, right?" she said, putting down her coffee. "You know people disappear up there all the time. 2 hunters last year, just gone." I laughed it off, but later that night, I did some research. She was right. In the past 5 years, at least a dozen people had gone missing and were near the swamp. Some were found, days later, miles away, disoriented and unable to remember where they'd been. Others were never seen again. I should have backed out. But I didn't. Instead, I packed my bag and drove to Massachusetts. By the time I reached the dirt road leading into the swamp, the sun had already dipped below the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the forest floor. My headlights bounced off the dense brush, illuminating the barely visible path ahead. The cabin was 5 miles in, down an overgrown logging trail no longer marked on any map. As I drove, the forest closed in, swallowing the last traces of civilization. My cell service vanished. The road narrowed. And then, finally, I saw it, Mark's truck, parked just outside the clearing. I should have felt relief. But instead, I felt something else. Dread. The cabin was exactly how I remembered it. The front door slightly ajar. The chimney cold and unused. The old iron trapdoor in the floor, sealed shut with its rusted padlock. Mark wasn't outside. I stepped out of my car, my boots crunching on the damp leaves. "Mark?" My voice sounded too loud in the silence. The trees didn't move. The wind didn't blow. It was the kind of stillness that makes you realize you're not alone. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight. Inside, the air smelled stale, untouched. A single lantern sat on the table, its wick unlit. There was no sign of Mark. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A message carved into the wooden table. "Do not open the door." I didn't know which door it meant. The front door? The trap door? And then, from somewhere in the woods, so far away I almost thought I imagined it, I heard a voice. A whisper. My name. The whisper echoed through the trees, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was my name. Daniel. The wind hadn't moved all night, but as soon as I heard it, a sudden gust blew through the trees, rattling the leaves and stirring the stagnant air. I stood frozen on the porch, staring into the pitch-black forest, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I knew better than to answer. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and leave. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped inside the cabin and shut the door behind me. The place was exactly as I remembered: rough wooden walls, a stone fireplace in the corner, and a few rusting bunk beds against the back wall. The only light came from the moon filtering through the dirty windows, casting long shadows over the floor. Everything was coated in dust, like no one had been here for years. But Mark's truck was outside. He had to be here somewhere. I reached for my flashlight and swept it over the room. Then I saw them. Boot prints. Fresh ones. They led from the front door to the middle of the room, then stopped at the trapdoor. The iron handle was clean, free of dust, like it had been touched recently. The old padlock, which had been rusted shut since we were kids, was broken. The chain hung loose. Mark had opened it. I crouched down, running my fingers over the deep scratches in the wood around the trapdoor's edges. They weren't new. Something had clawed at this from below, long ago. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Silence. Then, tap, tap, tap. 3 slow knocks from underneath. I scrambled backwards so fast I knocked over a chair. The noise echoed in the empty cabin. My breath came in shallow gasps as I aimed my flashlight at the trapdoor, half expecting it to burst open. But it didn't. I grabbed my phone. No service. Of course. I needed to find Mark. I needed to get the hell out of here. I forced myself to stand and step toward the back of the cabin, where a narrow hallway led to a storage room. The door was slightly open. I nudged it with my foot, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. It was empty. No, wait. Not empty. On the floor, next to an overturned crate, was Mark's backpack. I rushed over, unzipping it. Inside, I found his flashlight, his keys, a half-eaten protein bar. His phone was in there, too. Why would he leave that behind? That's when I noticed the papers. Old, yellowed pages, folded and shoved into the side pocket of his bag. I pulled them out, carefully unfolding them. The first was a handwritten journal entry, dated October 1974. We should have never opened the trapdoor. My hands trembled as I turned the page. We thought it was just an old storage cellar. But the smell, my God, the smell. And the sounds. At first, we thought it was just the wind coming through the trees. But then we saw them. Eyes. Watching from the darkness. Tom swore it was an animal, but animals don't whisper. I swallowed hard, flipping to the next page. It only comes at night. It can't stand the light. We barricaded the trapdoor, but we hear it moving underneath us. Scratching. Tapping. Whispering. We thought it was inside our heads, but then it spoke our names. My flashlight flickered. The beam wavered, then dimmed. I turned toward the trapdoor. The chain was moving. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, watching as the loose chain shifted ever so slightly, as if something beneath the cabin was pulling on it. I backed toward the front door, gripping Mark's bag tight. I didn't care where he was. I needed to leave. I turned the doorknob. Locked. The old wooden latch that had been open when I walked in was now bolted shut. I was trapped. Then, from somewhere deep beneath the cabin, a voice. Daniel. It sounded just like Mark. I froze, my fingers still wrapped around the doorknob, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. It was Mark's voice, but something about it was wrong. The way it stretched my name, slow, deliberate, like an old cassette tape warping in the player, made my skin crawl. I turned toward the trapdoor. The chain had stopped moving, but something else caught my eye. The wood was wet. A dark, seeping stain spread outward from the cracks, filling the room with the sharp stench of rot, damp earth, and something worse, something that made my stomach turn. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for half a second before stabilizing again. I took an unsteady step backward, gripping the edge of the table to keep my balance. Mark? I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. If that's you, answer me. Silence stretched between the walls of the cabin. I held my breath, waiting, hoping I had imagined it. But then, from directly beneath me, so close it felt like it was coming from under my own feet, I heard it again. Help me, Dan. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening around the flashlight. I knew Mark's voice. I had known him for years. But this wasn't him. My body tensed as I forced myself to speak. Where are you? I asked, my throat dry. There was a pause, a long, heavy silence that stretched just long enough to make me think, for half a second, that I wouldn't get a response. Then, barely a whisper, barely more than breath against wood, it answered. Below. A wave of cold dread rolled through me, locking my muscles in place. My brain scrambled for explanations. Had Mark actually gone down there? Had he fallen into some forgotten basement or an old tunnel? But I knew better. The journal in his bag. The deep claw marks around the trapdoor. The broken lock. Whatever was beneath this cabin had been down there for a long time. And Mark, if he was even still alive, wasn't the one speaking to me. I backed toward the window, my fingers trembling around the flashlight as my mind raced for a way out. I needed to break the glass, climb through, run. But as I turned, the beam of my flashlight caught something that made my blood turn to ice. Boot prints. They led from the trapdoor, straight to the back wall. Then they just stopped. No scuff marks, no turn, no exit. Mark had walked to that spot and vanished. The floor creaked behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, just in time to see the trapdoor begin to lift. The iron handle turned with a groan, the thick wooden slab shifting upward an inch at a time. My breath caught in my throat as something pushed through the gap. A hand. Long, pale fingers curled over the edge of the doorframe, the nails blackened and too sharp. A thick, viscous liquid dripped from the fingertips, spattering onto the wood. My legs locked in place as I took a slow step backward. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to run, to do anything but stand there. But I couldn't. The hand twitched, the fingers stretching unnaturally. And then, they bent backward. Each joint cracked and twisted in the wrong direction, the knuckles contorting as though something inside was forcing them apart from within. A cold, wet breath slipped through the gap, and the voice came again, low and pleading, but no longer alone. Help me, Dan. It wasn't just Mark's voice anymore. It was many voices. A chorus of whispers, overlapping, repeating my name in different tones. Some male, some female, some young, some impossibly old. I broke. I turned and threw myself at the window, glass shattering around me as I crashed through, hitting the frozen ground outside. The impact sent pain lancing up my arm, but I barely felt it. My mind was already screaming at me to move. I scrambled to my feet, my hands slick with blood, and sprinted toward my car. Mark's truck sat in the clearing, its doors open, but there was no sign of him. I didn't stop. I yanked open my car door, jammed the key into the ignition, and turned it. Nothing. The engine wouldn't turn over. I swore under my breath, my entire body trembling as I tried again. Click. Click. Silence. And then, from behind me, from the cabin, the door slammed open. My breath hitched as I turned, just in time to see something standing in the doorway. Tall. Thin. Wrong. The moonlight barely touched its face, but I saw enough. It was Mark. But his skin was stretched too tight, his lips pulled too far back, as if something inside him had been stuffed into the wrong shape. His eyes weren't eyes at all, just dark, empty holes, staring straight at me. His head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then, he smiled. Help me, Dan. I slammed my fist against the dashboard, my voice shaking. Start, damn it. The engine roared to life. The thing that looked like Mark took a slow, deliberate step forward. I didn't wait. I threw the car into reverse, tires kicking up dirt as I spun out of the clearing. My last glimpse in the rearview mirror, just before the trees swallowed the road, was Mark standing in the headlights, that terrible, impossible grin still locked onto his face. Then, as my car sped away, I saw his lips move one final time. I couldn't hear it, but I knew he was saying my name. I drove faster than I ever had in my life, the dirt road barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. The trees pressed in from all sides, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Every nerve in my body screamed to keep moving, to get as far away from that cabin as possible, but my mind couldn't let go of what I had just seen. That thing wearing Mark's face, smiling like it knew something I didn't. My hands were slick with sweat, my grip tightening on the wheel as my tires skidded around a sharp turn. I didn't dare check the rearview mirror again. The only thing that mattered was getting back to the main road. My GPS was useless, no signal out here, but I knew the way. 5 miles of dirt and gravel, then an old service road, then asphalt. Once I hit pavement, I could get back to town, find help, call someone. But as I took another turn, something cold curled around my stomach. The road ahead was wrong. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing to a stop. My headlights shone ahead, illuminating the path in front of me. The road I had driven on had been narrow but clear, a single-lane stretch of dirt winding through the swamp. But now, it was gone. In its place stood trees. Thick, ancient oaks, their twisted roots pushing up from the ground like grasping fingers. Spanish moss draped from the branches, swaying in the night breeze. The road simply wasn't there anymore. It was as if I had never driven down it in the first place. I stared, my breathing ragged, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't possible. This wasn't possible. I shifted the car into reverse, my tires spinning against the dirt as I backed up. My mind raced through possibilities. Had I taken a wrong turn in my panic? No, that wasn't it. There had been no turns, no side paths. There was only one way in and out of the clearing. And now it was gone. The trees ahead of me shifted. Not from the wind, not from an animal. They moved deliberately. I saw it, branches twisting, trunks bending, roots slithering through the dirt. The entire forest was rearranging itself. I hit the gas. My car lurched backward, bouncing over uneven ground as I tried to retrace my route. My headlights barely cut through the thickening fog that had begun to seep through the trees, curling around my tires, creeping across the windshield like searching fingers. I kept my foot on the pedal, trying to outrun the suffocating mist. Then something ran across the road. I barely saw it, just a blur of movement, but it was fast. My heart nearly stopped as I swerved to avoid it, my tires skidding against the dirt. Whatever it was too big to be an animal. A deer, maybe? But no, deer didn't move like that. It had been hunched, limbs too long, head too low, almost like it was crawling. My car slammed into something solid. The impact threw me forward, my seatbelt locking against my chest. The headlights flickered, the engine sputtering as smoke curled from under the hood. I had hit something. Shaking, I reached for the door handle and forced myself out. The cold night air hit me like a wave, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something that smelled like decay. I stepped around the front of the car, my knees weak, my breath coming in short gasps. The tree I had hit wasn't a tree at all. It was Mark's truck. I staggered backward, my stomach flipping. It was impossible. I had just left this behind in the clearing. But there it was, Mark's old pickup, rusted and dented, its front bumper smashed where I had hit it. The driver's side door hung open, swaying slightly. The keys were still in the ignition. I swallowed hard, trying to force down the rising panic in my throat. I stepped closer, peering inside. Mark wasn't there. His bag was still in the passenger seat, his flashlight resting on the dashboard, the same way he always left it. But the seats were soaked. Dark, wet stains covered the fabric, still fresh, still dripping. A low sound echoed from the trees around me. Not an animal. Not the wind. Laughter. I turned slowly, the fog parting just enough for me to see the shape standing at the edge of the tree line. Mark. Or at least, something that looked like Mark. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his skin too pale in the moonlight. His mouth was too wide, that same impossible grin splitting his face. His eyes were hollow pits, black and endless, like something had scooped them out and left nothing behind. I couldn't move. Then, in that slow, drawn-out voice, it spoke. "You shouldn't have left, Dan." Its head twitched. A shudder ran through its body, as though something inside was trying to fit into the wrong shape. Its shoulders rolled, its spine stretching unnaturally. And then, it took a step toward me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't breathe, didn't look back. My body moved on pure instinct, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted into the trees, the laughter following me, stretching into something not human. The forest blurred around me, the fog thickening, the ground shifting beneath my feet like it didn't want me to leave. I didn't stop running until I saw the cabin again. The door stood open, the trapdoor inside wide open. And from within that black, gaping hole, something was crawling out. I had nowhere else to go. I barely had time to stop myself before my momentum nearly carried me over the threshold. My boots slid against the damp earth as I skidded to a halt just outside the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door hung open, the trapdoor inside gaping wide like a hungry mouth. The wood around its edges was soaked in that thick, dark liquid, and the smell, it was overpowering now, thick with the scent of rot and damp earth, something ancient and long buried forcing its way up into the world. From the darkness below, I heard movement, slow and deliberate, the sound of something pulling itself upward. I knew I should run, that I should turn around and keep going, straight into the swamp, into the unknown, anywhere but here. But my legs wouldn't move, my instinct screaming that whatever was inside that pit, I could not afford to turn my back on it. So I stood there, watching, waiting as the thing from below began to rise. A hand emerged first, long fingers curling over the wooden edge of the trapdoor. The skin was stretched too tight, too pale, glistening with that same thick black liquid that had seeped into the floorboards. Then another hand followed, nails cracked and jagged, grasping at the wood as something began to pull itself free. And then, I saw its face. It was Mark. But it wasn't. His head tilted upward, his skin slick and wet like something freshly pulled from the mud. His eyes were black voids, empty pits that seemed to pull in the light rather than reflect it. His mouth, his smile, was still stretched impossibly wide, frozen in that grotesque grin. But worse than the sight of him was the way he moved, his limbs jerking and twitching as though something inside was forcing him to operate like a puppet with tangled strings. Then, he spoke. The voice came from deep inside his throat, layered, wrong, as though more than one voice was speaking at once. "Daniel." My entire body locked up. I had heard that voice before, not long ago, just beneath my feet. "Help me, Dan." My stomach twisted, because it wasn't just Mark's voice anymore. There were others. I could hear them now, whispering, overlapping, coming from inside him. I took a step back, but Mark's head snapped toward me, his neck bending too far, his entire body shuddering like it was struggling to hold itself together. "You left me." The words crawled from his throat, slow and deliberate, his voice shifting, warping, twisting into something else entirely. "You left us." I turned and ran. I heard the thing lurch forward, its body dragging itself fully out of the trapdoor, but I didn't stop to look back. I barely felt my legs as they carried me into the trees, my breath sharp and ragged, every muscle in my body screaming to keep moving. The forest was wrong, the trees shifting again, closing in, their branches reaching downward like skeletal hands. The fog was thicker now, alive, twisting around my ankles, curling around my arms, pulling at me as I stumbled forward. My feet caught on exposed roots, the ground too soft, too wet, like something breathing beneath the dirt. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I only knew I had to keep running. Behind me, I heard footsteps. No, not footsteps. Something faster. The sound of bones snapping, bending, twisting. I ran harder, my lungs burning, my vision blurring, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Now I could feel it closing in, just behind me, reaching. a hand wrapped around my ankle. I crashed to the ground, my chin slamming against the wet earth, my ears ringing from the impact, my vision going white with pain. My hands clawed at the ground, trying to pull myself forward, but the fingers around my leg tightened. It was Mark. He was on all fours, his limbs twisted in ways that no human body should move, his face inches from mine. His mouth was open too wide, his breath pouring out in thick, white mist, his eyes nothing but black pits filled with movement. And inside those pits, there were others. I saw them, faces shifting just beneath the surface of his skin, hundreds of them. Their mouths opened in unison and they screamed. I kicked out, my boot connecting with his jaw, the force of it knocking me free. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain in my leg, and ran. The trees broke suddenly, the swamp opening up into a clearing. And there was a house. Not the cabin. A different house. Old, rotting, its windows black and empty, a single door swinging slightly in the breeze. There was nowhere else to go. I sprinted for the house, throwing myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me just as something crashed against the wood. Silence. I pressed my back against the door, my chest heaving, my fingers shaking. Outside, I heard laughter, slow, mocking. Then, a whisper. "You shouldn't have come back, Daniel." I turned, my breath catching in my throat. Inside the house, lined up against the far wall, were photographs. Dozens of them. Hundreds. And in every single one was Mark. Standing. Smiling. Watching. And behind him, in the background of every photo, almost too small to notice, was me. I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The photographs stretched across the entire far wall, framed in cheap black wood, arranged in perfect rows and columns. Every single one of them featured Mark standing in different places, sometimes in front of the cabin, sometimes by the swamp, sometimes in places I didn't recognize. The unsettling part wasn't just his presence, but the way he looked. In every photo, he had that same twisted grin, the same hollow, empty eyes. And in every background, hidden in the shadows, just barely visible, was me. Sometimes it was just a silhouette, my figure blurred as though I had been caught mid-motion. Other times, I was standing still, watching from a distance. Some of the photos were old, decades old, their edges yellowed and curling with time. But that was impossible. I had only been here once before, years ago, as a teenager. I hadn't been back until today. I forced myself to step closer, my pulse hammering in my ears as I examined the photographs up close. The images were crisp, clear, too sharp for anything taken with an old camera. The lighting was always perfect, as though someone had been carefully composing each shot. A sick feeling curled in my stomach as I ran my fingers over the glass of one frame, my own face reflected against Mark's smiling one. Then I noticed the dates. Each photo had a small white label at the bottom, written in neat, almost mechanical handwriting. October 5th, 1983. October 5th, 1992. October 5th, 2005. The pattern continued, each one taken exactly 9 years apart. The last one made my blood run cold. October 5th, 2021. Today. I took a step back, my legs unsteady. The moment I moved, I heard it, a soft creak from the floorboards behind me. I spun, my flashlight beam cutting through the dust-choked air. The room beyond the entryway stretched into darkness, the ceiling sagging, the furniture draped in tattered white sheets. The entire house felt wrong, like it shouldn't exist, like the walls had been built to trap rather than shelter. A shadow shifted at the edge of my vision. I lifted my flashlight, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the threshold of the next room, someone was standing. No. Not someone. Mark. Or at least, what was left of him. His body stood rigid, motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. The dim light barely touched his features, but I could see the outline of his grin, wide and unnatural, stretching too far across his face. His clothes were damp, clinging to his skin like he had just crawled out of something deep and wet. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. I took a step back, and his head snapped forward. Not a twitch. Not a slow movement. An instant, jarring shift. A whisper brushed against my ear, though no one was close enough to have spoken. You were always coming back. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted for the door, but the moment my fingers closed around the handle, the wood jerked violently against me. The entire frame shifted, the walls groaning as if the house itself were alive. My flashlight flickered, the shadows stretching unnaturally long against the floor. The temperature in the room dropped. My breath clouded in front of me. The walls creaked and shifted, the air thick with the scent of wood decay. Somewhere in the house, something dragged itself across the floor. A whisper, close now, too close. You've been here before. I turned, pressing my back against the door, my fingers shaking as I tried the handle again. It wouldn't budge. The wood felt slick under my grip, damp and pulsing as though something was breathing beneath the surface. Then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Mark took a step forward. His head twitched to the side, the bones in his neck snapping too loudly. His chest rose and fell with slow, heavy breaths. But his mouth never stopped grinning. Never moved. The lights in the house flickered, the photographs rattling on the walls. Somewhere, deep beneath the floor, something knocked. I backed away, my mind racing. There had to be another way out. I turned toward the hallway leading deeper into the house, my body screaming at me to move. Whatever this place was, whatever had been waiting here, it wanted me inside. A realization slammed into me all at once. This wasn't just a house. This was a trap. And I had walked right into it. I didn't have a choice anymore. I bolted into the dark hallway, Mark's voice whispering after me, too close, too familiar. You shouldn't have come back, Daniel. I sprinted down the dark hallway, my boots slamming against the warped wooden floor, the stale air thick with dust and something worse, something damp, rotting, breathing. My flashlight flickered wildly, the beam struggling against the suffocating dark. The hallway stretched further than it should have, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering as if the house itself was closing in around me. Behind me, the footsteps followed. Slow. Deliberate. Each step precise, measured, unhurried, as if whatever wore Mark's face knew I had nowhere to go. I reached a doorway on my right, shoving it open without hesitation. The room inside was barely lit, the furniture draped in sheets, the edges of everything frayed with time. The walls were lined with more photographs, but these weren't framed like the ones in the main room. They were pinned, taped, hundreds of them covering every inch of space like wallpaper. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. They were all of me. My hands trembled as I lifted one from the wall, the paper thin and brittle beneath my fingertips. The photo showed me standing outside the cabin, but not just tonight, different versions of me. Younger. Older. In clothes I didn't recognize, with expressions I didn't remember making. Some were faded, others freshly printed. And in every single one, just behind me in the background, barely visible in the shadows, Mark was there. Watching. Smiling. A floorboard creaked in the hall. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The open door framed his silhouette, his two long limbs casting jagged shadows against the floor. The grin on his face stretched wider, his eyes black, hollow voids. Then, he moved. Not walked. Not lunged. Twitched. His body jolted forward in a series of unnatural jerks, like something was trying to learn how to move inside of him, like a marionette on tangled strings. I threw myself across the room, my shoulders slamming into a second door at the back. The wood gave way, and I tumbled through, hitting the ground hard. My flashlight rolled from my grasp, spinning wildly before landing on its side, the beam illuminating something in front of me. My breath hitched. A staircase. Not a normal one, not like anything that should have been in a house like this. The steps led down, disappearing into a darkness so deep my flashlight couldn't cut through it. The air that seeped up from below was damp and wrong, filled with the unmistakable scent of earth, mildew, and something older than time. Another sound from behind me. I turned to see Mark standing in the doorway, his head tilted too far to the side. His fingers twitched at his sides, his shoulders shuddering as though something inside him was pressing against the limits of his skin. He opened his mouth, but his lips didn't move. The words poured out of him, layered and overlapping, too many voices speaking at once. You were never supposed to leave. I didn't think. I ran. Down the stairs, two at a time, my boots barely touching the steps as I plunged into the blackness below. The air grew thicker, the walls damp with something I didn't want to touch. My flashlight beam shook, bouncing wildly as the steps twisted downward in impossible directions. The house shouldn't have been this big. There was no way it could extend this far down. But it did. And then, I reached the bottom. The staircase ended abruptly in a stone chamber, its walls lined with more photographs, their edges curling with moisture. A single table sat in the center, covered in old, yellowed papers. My hand shook as I lifted the top sheet, the ink smudged but still legible. We should have never opened the trapdoor. My stomach dropped. I flipped to the next page, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. It can't stand the light. It can't leave unless it's invited. It wears their skin, but it isn't them. Don't listen to it. Don't let it call your name. The walls shuddered. I heard it coming down the stairs, the bones in its legs cracking with every step. I grabbed the flashlight, spinning to face the doorway just as Mark stepped into the room. The grin on his face never faltered. But now, he wasn't alone. Shadows stretched behind him, figures shifting within the blackness. More faces, more twisted smiles, more bodies stitched together by something that had learned to wear skin but didn't quite understand how to make it fit. Their heads jerked, their mouths opened too wide, and they spoke in unison. You were always going to be part of this, Daniel. I took a step back, my legs shaking. The photographs on the walls began to change, the images shifting as though something inside them was moving. The figures in the pictures, they were watching me. I clenched my jaw, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to end this. There was only one way out. I turned my flashlight to its highest setting, the beam flooding the room with searing white light. The moment it touched them, they screamed, a shrill, layered wail that rattled the walls. Their skin blistered, black liquid seeping from their hollow eyes. Mark, or whatever was wearing him, lurched backward, his body twisting as though something inside him was being ripped apart. The shadows reeled, pulling away from the light, their forms unraveling into the walls, into the photographs, into the very air itself. The house shook. The walls split. The entire chamber collapsed inward. I turned and ran. Up the stairs, my breath burning in my throat, my legs screaming with exhaustion. Behind me, the walls crumbled, the house coming apart, as if whatever held it together was being ripped away. The last thing I heard before I reached the surface was Mark's voice, not the thing wearing him, but the real one, buried deep beneath layers of something else. Run. I burst through the front door just as the house caved in behind me. The sky above was just beginning to lighten with the first traces of dawn, the mist receding, the swamp quiet once more. My car sat where I had left it, the road clear, as if nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't hesitate. I got in, turned the key, and this time, the engine roared to life. As I pulled away, my hands still shaking, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. There was nothing but trees. No house. No cabin. No Mark. But just as I rounded the final bend in the road, I caught one last glimpse of something standing at the edge of the tree line. Watching. Smiling. And in the growing light of dawn, I finally saw what I had missed before. It wasn't Mark anymore. I drove without stopping, gripping the wheels so tight my knuckles ached. The morning sun cast long shadows over the empty road, the trees blurring past, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every glance in the rearview mirror made my stomach lurch. I half expected to see him sitting in the back seat, grinning that impossible grin, waiting for me to finally look long enough to realize I'd never really left. The road twisted through the swamp, but I kept my foot on the gas, needing to reach the highway, to see real signs of life, to be around people again. I forced my brain to focus on what I knew. Mark was gone. The house was gone. The cabin, the photographs, the voices whispering my name, gone. But the truth hung in the back of my mind like a sickness. It wasn't over. I didn't know how I knew it, but I did. An hour later, I reached a gas station off Route 138, the first sign of civilization since I left the swamp. The lot was empty except for a single pickup truck, an old Chevy with rusted fenders, the kind you see in towns where time doesn't move right. The neon open sign buzzed in the window, but inside, the place looked deserted. The clerk sat behind the counter, staring at the static-filled screen of an old television, the station's yellowed walls lined with dusty racks of snacks that looked like they hadn't been restocked in months. I pulled into the lot, cutting the engine, trying to slow my breathing. My hands still shook as I stepped out of the car, the world too quiet. The sky was bright now, the morning sun spilling over the treetops, but the air felt wrong, like the weight of last night still pressed against my skin. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and the clerk barely glanced up. His eyes were sunken, his skin the color of old wax, like he'd been sitting in that exact spot for years. I grabbed a bottle of water from the nearest fridge, the cold seeping into my fingers. As I walked toward the counter, I caught sight of something that made my stomach twist, a corkboard near the register. It was covered in missing persons flyers, dozens of them, faces staring back at me, some of them children, some adults, some dating back decades, their photos faded and sun-bleached, pinned beside newer ones that still had the sharp pink smell of fresh printing. My gaze locked onto a name, Ethan Calloway, age 32, last seen near Hockomock Swamp. The date below his photo read October 5th, 2012. Exactly 9 years ago. My throat went dry. The pattern, the photos in the house, the dates, I wasn't the first. I wasn't supposed to leave. The realization hit me like a hammer to the ribs. Whatever had taken Mark, whatever had been waiting, it wanted someone to stay. But I had run. I had broken the cycle. And now, I wasn't sure what that meant. The clerk's voice snapped me back to the present. "You okay?" His tone was flat, uninterested, but there was something off in the way he looked at me. Like he knew. I forced a nod, setting the bottle on the counter. "Yeah. Just long drive." He rang me up in silence, the total flashing dull red on the register. As I reached for my wallet, something shifted in the reflection of the glass cooler behind him. A figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the parking lot. Watching. I turned, my stomach lurching, but when I looked, nothing was there. The lot was empty. The clerk exhaled sharply through his nose, sliding the bottle across the counter. "Storm rolled through last night," he muttered. "Strange things happen out there. People go missing." I didn't respond. I just took the water, nodding stiffly, and stepped back outside. The moment I crossed the threshold, my body locked up. My car door was open. I knew I had closed it. The driver's seat was wet, the same way Mark's truck had been when I found it in the swamp. A single footprint stained the floor mat, dark, damp, seeping into the fabric. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I reached forward, gripping the door handle, but the second my fingers brushed the metal, a voice whispered just behind me. "Daniel." I spun so fast I nearly fell, my pulse slamming against my ribs. No one was there. The lot was empty. But I knew, deep in my bones, that I wasn't alone. I climbed into the car, slamming the door shut, locking it instinctively. My breath came in sharp gasps as I forced the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but I didn't pull out right away. My hands clenched the wheel, knuckles white. I needed to think. Had I really escaped? Had I broken the pattern? Or had I brought something with me? I reached for the rearview mirror, my fingers trembling as I adjusted it. And then, I saw it. Not in the back seat. Not standing in the lot. but in the mirror itself. For a split second, my reflection wasn't mine. My own face, staring back at me, grinning too wide, my eyes black and hollow. The moment I blinked, it was gone. But I knew, with cold, sinking certainty, that I had made a terrible mistake. I had left. But I was never really gone. I gripped the steering wheel, my breath shallow, my heart hammering against my ribs. The morning sun bathed the empty highway in soft gold, but it did nothing to settle the growing dread curling inside me. My reflection in the rearview mirror had returned to normal, my own familiar face staring back at me, but I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't exhaustion. For the briefest moment, something else had been there, watching from inside my own skin. Forcing my hands to steady, I put the car in drive and pulled onto the road. The tires hummed against the pavement, the landscape shifting from dense woods to scattered houses, then into the outskirts of town. I needed to be around people, needed to hear voices that were whispering my name from the dark. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look into the mirror again. If I ignored it, if I acted normal, maybe it would go away. I drove straight to my apartment, barely remembering the turns I took, my mind stuck between the world I had escaped and the one I had returned to. My hands fumbled with the keys as I reached my door, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The moment I stepped inside, I locked the deadbolt, slid the chain in place, and pressed my back against the door. The silence of my home wrapped around me like a weighted blanket, but instead of comfort, it only made the fear grow. Everything looked the same, the couch slightly askew from how I had left it, a half-empty glass of water still sitting on the coffee table. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to believe that I was safe, that the nightmare had ended. Dropping my bag onto the floor, I made my way to the bathroom, gripping the counter as I turned on the sink, letting the cold water run over my fingers. I needed to wash the night away, needed to feel something solid and real. But then, I looked up. The mirror above the sink reflected the dimly lit bathroom, the pale morning light creeping in from the window. My face stared back at me, dark circles under my eyes, exhaustion carved into every line of my expression. But something was off. My heart skipped. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the glass. My reflection wasn't breathing. The realization sent ice rushing through my veins. I took a step back, gripping the edge of the sink, watching as it stood perfectly still, its chest unmoving, its expression locked in place. And then, slowly, too slowly, it smiled. Not a normal smile. Not one I had ever made before. It was the same impossible grin I had seen on Mark's face in the swamp. The moment my breath caught in my throat, it moved. My reflection's hand reached up, pressing against the inside of the glass. The surface warped, a ripple spreading outward like a stone dropped into a still lake. My own fingers trembled as I reached toward it, not because I wanted to, but because something inside me needed to know if the glass was still solid. Just before my fingertips touched the mirror, it spoke. "You left me behind." The voice came from inside the glass, my own voice, but layered with something else, something too deep, too familiar, something that had been with me since the moment I ran from the house, since the moment I broke the cycle. I stumbled backward, slamming against the wall, my pulse hammering as the glass continued to shift, breathing, stretching, twisting. My reflection's mouth moved again, but the words didn't come from its lips. They came from behind me. "You let me out." A sharp pain lanced through my skull, my vision blurring. The room tilted, the walls narrowing, the ceiling pressing down as the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. My own body felt heavy, my limbs sluggish, like something was pulling me back. The mirror rippled once more, my reflection beginning to peel away, its face splitting, stretching, something emerging from inside it. I scrambled for the door, my fingers fumbling with the handle, but the moment I turned it, everything went black. I woke up to the sound of knocking. My body ached, my limbs stiff as if I had been lying there for hours. The bathroom light flickered overhead, the air still thick with the scent of wet soil. My heart pounded as I sat up, my fingers digging into the cold tile floor. The knocking came again. Not from my front door. From inside the mirror. My breath caught, my body frozen in place as I forced myself to look up. The reflection was normal again, just my own face staring back at me, but it wasn't right. The eyes were empty, the skin too pale. And then, it blinked. I didn't. The knocking grew louder, the glass trembling, the shape inside it pressing forward, trying to push through. My own voice whispered back at me, muffled, distant. "Let me back in." I stumbled to my feet, reaching for the nearest object, a bottle of mouthwash, and hurled it at the mirror with everything I had. The glass shattered, shards raining down onto the sink, my reflection splintering into 1,000 broken pieces. The moment it broke, the knocking stopped. The room fell silent. I stood there, panting, my hands shaking violently. The shattered fragments of the mirror reflected jagged pieces of my face, but I didn't see it anymore. No impossible grin. No hollow eyes. But I knew better than to think it was over. Slowly, I backed out of the bathroom, shutting the door, locking it behind me as if that could keep it inside. The apartment was silent. The world outside was normal. But the fear inside me hadn't left. Because I had seen what happened to Mark. And I knew whatever was in that swamp had followed me home. I didn't escape. I brought it with me. I haven't looked in a mirror since. I cover them, avoid them, walk past reflective surfaces without glancing down. It doesn't matter where I go, doesn't matter how far I run, I still feel it. In the quiet moments, in the dead of night, I hear the whisper just behind me. You left me behind. And sometimes, just for a second, when the lights are low and the world is still, I catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. A movement that doesn't belong to me. A reflection that smiles when I don't.